Never speak Indian again. Never.
In 1885, the United States government tried to count something it barely understood. Officials estimated more than 110,000 native people across the plains could hold a full conversation without saying a word out loud. No dictionaries, no classrooms, no written alphabet for most of these nations. But traders, translators, and teenage brides like Sacagawea were somehow fluent in 3, 4, sometimes 5 languages before they turned 20. The secret wasn't talent. It was a set of memory systems so effective that pieces of them are still being taught today. One belt, one story, one sign at a time. The scale of the problem comes first, because it was a real problem, not a curiosity. North America, before European contact, held somewhere between 300 and 500 distinct native languages, sorted into dozens of unrelated families. Algonquian had nothing in common with Siouan. Siouan had nothing in common with Athabascan. A person could walk for a week in almost any direction and cross into territory where every noun, every verb ending, every kinship term reset to 0. Trade still had to happen. Marriages still had to happen. Wars still had to be negotiated down into peace. Somebody had to bridge that gap over and over without a single shared alphabet to lean on. Start with the hands. Long before Europeans arrived, the plains were already a linguistic maze. The Blackfoot spoke an Algonquian language. Their neighbours the Crow spoke Siouan. 100 miles in any direction could put you next to a nation whose grammar shared almost nothing with your own. So the people who lived there built something outside of speech entirely. Historians now call it Plains Indian Sign Language, though the people who used it just called it hand talk. By the time officials were counting signers in 1885, hand talk was already centuries old. It had spread from the Gulf Coast north through Blackfoot, Cheyenne, Sioux, Kiowa, and Arapaho territory. And it worked because it didn't belong to any single nation. A Kiowa trader could sit down across from a Cheyenne stranger, and within minutes they'd be negotiating a horse trade, telling a story, or arranging a marriage, all without either one understanding a word the other spoke aloud. Deaf members of these communities used the same system as a first language, not a substitute one. Hearing members used it as a second, third, or fourth. It wasn't a workaround. It was infrastructure, built and maintained the same way a road or a bridge is, by people who needed it to hold weight. Here's the part that gets missed. Hand talk didn't just sit next to spoken languages, it taught people how to learn them. Once you'd trained yourself to track meaning through gesture, rhythm, and context instead of vocabulary alone, picking up a neighboring nation's spoken language got easier, because you were already fluent in reading intent before a single word landed. A trader who grew up signing before he could talk had a head start every time he crossed into new territory. He wasn't starting from silence, he was starting from a shared grammar of attention that most spoken languages layer on top of anyway. Tone, pacing, the lift of a hand at the end of a sentence. Hand talk wasn't a loose pile of gestures either, it carried real grammar. Hand shapes could act like verb roots, changing meaning depending on how fast they moved, how far they travelled, and where they landed relative to the signer's body. A single sign for buffalo, combined with a sweeping motion, could mean a herd running. while a small, sharp version of the same sign meant one animal standing still. Distance was tense. Speed was mood. A child raised signing before speech learned an entire second logic for how meaning gets built, years before a spoken second language ever entered the picture. And that early training turned out to be the head start everything else in this system relied on. Jerry Potts understood that head start better than almost anyone. Born in the 1830s to a Scottish father and a Blackfoot mother, Potts grew up moving between camps and forts, and by adulthood he was speaking English, Crow and Blackfoot well enough to work as a guide and interpreter across what's now Alberta and Montana. He didn't learn any of it from a textbook. He learned it the way almost every fluent multilingual on the plains did. Immersion came first, structure second. And the structure came from watching, not from being taught in the way we'd recognize a classroom today. That's the second layer of the system, and it's the one nobody watching from outside ever thinks to look for: marriage. Intertribal marriage wasn't incidental to how people became multilingual. It was often the mechanism itself. When a Shoshone woman married into a Hidatsa community, her children grew up hearing both languages from birth, switching between them the way any bilingual household does today. Sacagawea herself was born Shoshone, captured as a child by a Hidatsa raiding party, and raised speaking Hidatsa alongside her first language. By the time Lewis and Clark hired her and her husband Toussaint Charbonneau in 1804, she could move between Shoshone and Hidatsa, while Charbonneau carried Hidatsa and French. Between the two of them, a single conversation could pass through 4 languages before it ever reached an English-speaking ear, relayed sentence by sentence, twice translated, and still accurate enough to guide an entire expedition across a continent. She wasn't unusual for having that skill. She was unusual for how visible her skill became to history. In early Virginia, colonial leaders noted that Powhatan children raised in mixed households after captures and alliances often ended up bilingual almost by necessity, absorbing a second language the way children do everywhere, quickly, and without ever framing it as a lesson. So immersion built the foundation, but fluency in 5 languages doesn't survive on immersion alone, not across a lifetime, not across a continent where the nearest speaker of a rare dialect might be 3 days' ride away. That's where memory technology took over. Kinship terms alone could carry a stunning amount of that load. In many native languages, a single word does the job English needs a whole sentence to do, naming not just the relative, but their exact position in the family, their generation, sometimes even whether they're older or younger than the speaker. Learning a second language's kinship system wasn't a vocabulary list. It was learning an entirely different map of how people relate to each other. And elders drilled that map into children constantly, through daily address, through correction at the dinner fire, through the simple repetition of being called by the right term 1,000 times before anyone ever explained the rule behind it. By the time a child could speak in full sentences, they'd absorbed a second family structure, along with a second grammar, without ever sitting through a single lesson labelled as one. Picture a hide stretched across a frame, maybe 6 feet long, painted with a spiral of small, strange images. A horse, a comet bright enough that everyone in camp remembered exactly where they were standing when it crossed the sky. A single red mark. To an outsider, it looks like decoration. To a Lakota, Dakota or Kiowa winter count keeper, it's an entire history. One image standing in for 1 year, going back sometimes a century or more. The keeper didn't memorize a list of facts. He memorized a story attached to each image, and the image itself was the retrieval cue. Point to the comet, and the whole year came back. Who died? Who was born? Which nation attacked? Which treaty held? All in the exact order it happened. The Haudenosaunee built something just as precise out of shell beads. Wampum belts recorded treaties, alliances, and declarations of war in patterns of purple and white. And at councils, a keeper would run his hands across the belt while reciting the exact agreement it represented, word for word, sometimes translated on the spot into the language of whoever was sitting across the fire. A war belt carried a black background and a red hatchet worked into the pattern. A friendship belt carried white rows woven straight through the middle, nation to nation, unbroken. The design wasn't art, it was an index, and reading it correctly could be the difference between a council that ended in trade and one that ended in bloodshed. This is the third layer, and linguist Ophelia Zepeda named it precisely. Oral tradition runs on patterns, schemas, and mnemonic devices that let a person store enormous amounts of information and retrieve exactly the right piece of it at exactly the right moment. Songs carried genealogies, sung the same way at every retelling, so no generation could quietly edit the past. Ceremonies carried medical knowledge, repeated on a fixed seasonal cycle, so the information never had time to decay between uses. Ojibwe scroll keepers used birch bark, etched with symbols, to hold entire teachings from the Mdewiwin society, decoded only by someone who'd already learned the accompanying oral key by heart. None of these systems worked in isolation. The image needed the story, and the story needed the image, and together they held what a written page holds for us, minus the paper, minus the ink, minus any guarantee that a fire or a flood couldn't take it in a single afternoon. Now stack a second language on top of that same memory architecture, and something interesting happens. The patterns transfer. A person trained from childhood to store a year's worth of history in a single pictograph, or a clan's entire genealogy in one song, already has the cognitive scaffolding built to store a second grammar, a second set of kinship terms, a second way of naming the world. The tool doesn't care which language it's applied to. Learn the method once on your first language, and you can point it at a second, a third, a fourth. The same way learning to sight-read music makes the next instrument faster to pick up. Trade forced the issue constantly, everywhere, all at once. Along the lower Mississippi, dozens of Muskogean-speaking nations relied on a simplified, shared trade language called Mobilian Jargon, just to move goods and settle disputes across group lines. On the Pacific coast, Chinook jargon did the same job, blending Chinookan, Nootka, French and English into something everyone could use without anyone having to abandon their own tongue at home. These jargons weren't lesser languages, they were deliberately engineered bridges, built by people who needed reliable communication and had no reason to wait for anyone else to build it for them. A fur trader moving down the Columbia River in the early 1800s might use Chinook jargon at the trading post, his own language at the campfire, and hand talk if he crossed onto the plains, switching between all three before lunch. And then there was the cost of getting it wrong. A mistranslated word in a treaty council wasn't an academic error. It could mean the difference between a peace that held and a war that started by accident. Interpreters carried that weight constantly, and it made them some of the most valuable people in any camp, fort, or trading post on the continent. Sarah Winnemucca, a Paiute woman who grew up fluent in English alongside her own language, spent years working as an interpreter and go-between during some of the most volatile years of contact in Nevada, standing in the exact spot where one wrong verb could tip a tense standoff into a shooting. Every fluent interpreter on the continent, whether trader, captive or bride, was operating with those stakes sitting somewhere behind every sentence they spoke. This wasn't theoretical risk. Along the French colonial Mississippi, officials repeatedly recorded how much regional stability depended on a small handful of interpreters like Joseph Bon, who was Quapaw and French, and worked alongside colonial agents precisely because he could carry a negotiation intact through two worldviews at once. When those interpreters got sick, died, or simply weren't available, the record shows negotiations stalling out or curdling into suspicion within days. The skill wasn't a nice extra. It was the hinge the entire relationship between nations swung on. That pressure is part of why the memory systems had to stay exact, down to the syllable. A winter count-keeper couldn't afford to drift on a treaty's terms from one telling to the next. A wampum reader couldn't paraphrase a war declaration and hope it landed the same way twice. The oral tradition's obsession with precise repetition, the same phrasing, the same rhythm, the same sequence of images passed down unchanged, wasn't tradition for its own sake. It was quality control on a system where the written backup didn't exist, and the consequences of forgetting were measured in lives, not grades. Then came the part of the story that isn't comfortable to tell, but has to be told anyway. Starting in the late 1800s, federal and church-run boarding schools removed native children from their families and punished them for speaking their own languages, sometimes violently. The goal was explicit. Sever the exact chain of transmission this episode has spent the last several minutes describing. Winter count keepers grew old, with no apprentice trained to continue the count. Hand talk, once spoken by over 100,000 people, dropped toward fewer than 100 fluent signers by some recent estimates. The multilingual fluency that let a Sacagawea or a Jerry Potts move between 4 or 5 worlds became, for their grandchildren's generation, something actively punished in a classroom. The system wasn't lost because it stopped working. It was lost because it was targeted deliberately by policy. But it didn't disappear. Today, tribal language programs across dozens of nations are rebuilding the same architecture their ancestors used, sometimes with a phone camera standing in for a winter count hide. A grandmother recorded on video teaching kinship terms to her grandchildren is doing exactly what a wampum keeper did at a council fire, attaching language to memory, memory to relationship, and relationship to survival. Immersion schools are putting toddlers in rooms where only the ancestral language is spoken, the same immersion first order that raised Sacagawea and Charbonneau's children. Because after a century of trying other methods, it's still the one that produces fluent speakers fastest. Hand talk itself has a small but committed group of learners, now working to keep it from crossing the line from endangered to gone. The Wôpanâak Language Reclamation Project pulled a language that had no living fluent speakers left, none, and rebuilt it from centuries-old written records into a spoken, taught, living tongue again, raising a new generation of children who speak it as a first language, the same way Sacagawea once spoke Hidatsa. The tools changed. Deerskin gave way to database, and Firelit Council gave way to classroom. But the underlying method is the same one this whole episode has been describing. Pair the sound to a memory, drill it daily, and hand it to the next person before you run out of time to teach it. So the next time someone tells you a language can only be learned from a textbook, remember the hide painted with a single comet, the belt woven with a red hatchet, and the woman who carried 4 languages across a continent before she turned 20, never once opening a book to do it. Which raises the harder question. If people with no written word between them could hold 5 languages and centuries of history in memory alone, what does it say about what gets lost the moment a culture is told its own way of remembering isn't good enough? The languages that survived did it because someone refused to let the chain break. One generation past the point it was supposed to end. Somewhere right now, a teenager is learning their grandmother's language off a phone app built on that exact same instinct. If you want to see how that revival is going, the next video on this channel follows one of those programs from first lesson to first fluent sentence.